Regular Show peaked on October 1st, 2012. That night, 3.047 million people watched a Season 4 premiere called Exit 9B, and the show hit a number it would never reach again. 4 years later, the same show was drawing 785,000 viewers on its worst nights. The same characters, the same park, the same creator, a quarter of the audience. That collapse did not happen because of bad luck. It happened because of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments across 4 seasons. The romance arc that turned the show's main character into someone the audience actively rooted against. The writer departures that hollowed out the creative rooms season by season. The dome, the space arc. The character who spent 3 seasons going nowhere before being written out with a background cameo on a submarine. Welcome to Regularverse. This is the full story of how Regular Show declined. The viewership peak and fall. The numbers tell the story. Regular Show premiered on September 6, 2010 on Cartoon Network. The first episode, called The Power, was watched by 2.097 million people. That number sounds big, and it was. For a brand new show from a first-time creator with no track record and a premise that was, by any reasonable measure, completely insane. 2 animal park workers whose attempts to avoid chores kept ending in supernatural disasters. Pulling over 2 million viewers on opening night was a genuine achievement. The show was weird. The show was funny. And enough people showed up to prove that both of those things could exist in the same cartoon at the same time. What happened next was even more surprising. The ratings grew. Not just a little. They grew significantly, steadily, and then all at once. By the time Season 2 arrived, the show had already built something. By Season 3, it had become one of Cartoon Network's most dependable performers. The audience wasn't just watching, it was coming back. Week after week, kids were tuning in to find out what ridiculous catastrophe Mordecai and Rigby would stumble into next. The show had found its people, and its people had found it. Then came Season 4. The 4th season premiere, an episode called Exit 9B, aired on October 1st, 2012. The plot was simple enough on the surface. A villain tries to take over the park. Every enemy Mordecai and Rigby had ever faced gets resurrected to help him do it, and the park crew has to fight them all off. It was loud, it was chaotic, and it was exactly the kind of escalated nonsense the show had spent 3 seasons building toward. Cartoon Network put serious promotional muscle behind it. They advertised it as an event. They wanted people to show up, and people showed up. 3.047 million viewers watched Exit 9B. That number, confirmed by Nielsen Research and announced in an official Cartoon Network press release, was the highest audience the show ever drew. The release called it the show's best performance in its history. It ranked as the #1 telecast of that entire day across all television, not just kids' channels, all television. For children in the ages 2 to 11, 6 to 11, and 9 to 14, the Season 4 premiere beat the Season 3 premiere by 16%. It beat the Season 2 premiere by 25%. It beat the Season 1 premiere by 41%. Every season, more people had come. Every season, the show had grown. Season 4 was the top of the mountain, and it stayed near the top for a little while longer. Season 5 produced the show's second most watched episode, the Thanksgiving special from 2013, which drew 3.043 million viewers. The audience was still there. The appetite was still there. The question was whether the show could keep feeding it. The answer, as the numbers quietly revealed over the next 3 seasons, was no. Season 6 ran from October 2014 through June 2015. The most watched episode that season, New Bro on Campus, drew 2.241 million viewers. That is still a healthy number by almost any standard, but it was 800,000 fewer people than had watched the Season 4 premiere just 2 years earlier. The floor had also dropped. The least watched episode of Season 6, called The End of Muscle Man, drew only 1.383 million viewers. In 2 years, the show had gone from regularly pulling 3 million viewers to episodes scraping past 1 million on a good week. Then Season 7 happened, and the numbers stopped being merely concerning and started being alarming. Season 7 ran from June 2015 through June 2016. The most watched episode of the entire season was The Dome Experiment Special, which drew 1.597 million viewers. That number, the best the show managed all season, was lower than the worst episode of Season 5. At the bottom end, an episode called Cube Bros drew 785,000 viewers. Not even 1 million people watched that episode. To put that in perspective, 2.3 million more people had watched Exit 9B than watched Cube Bros. The show had lost more than 3/4 of its peak audience in 5 years. Season 8, the final season, did not release the same granular episode-by-episode viewer data in the same format, but the trajectory was clear. A show that once reliably drew 2 to 3 million viewers every week was ending its run as a niche product, watched by under 1 million people on its weakest nights. The easy explanation for all of this is cord cutting. Cable television was losing viewers across the board during this period. Kids were watching things on YouTube, on Netflix, on tablets in the backseat of cars. Cartoon Network's overall ratings were declining. So were Nickelodeon's. So were every kid-focused cable channels. The platform itself was shrinking. But that explanation only goes so far, because it does not account for the pattern of the decline, only its existence. When a show loses viewers purely because its platform is shrinking, it tends to lose them evenly across the board. Every show on the network drops around the same rate. That is not what happened with regular show. Adventure Time, which aired on the same network during the same era and faced the same cord-cutting pressures, maintained stronger relative performance longer into its run. The regular show drop was steeper and more pronounced than a pure platform explanation would predict. The timing matters too. The sharpest single-season drop in regular show's viewership history, from the 3 million range in seasons 4 and 5 down to the 1.5 million range in season 7, tracks almost exactly with the seasons that fans and critics most frequently identify as the period when the show lost its way. Season 6 is consistently ranked last in fan polls. The romance storyline that dominated seasons 5 and 6 was the subject of the most sustained negative fan reaction the show ever received. The Thomas character arc, which was introduced in season 4 and concluded in season 6, was described even by the creator himself as something that wasn't planned from the beginning. The space arc that defined seasons 7 and 8 was something J.G. Quintel himself admitted he initially thought was a bad idea. His exact words in an interview were that sending them to space was, quote, dumb. Ratings are not a perfect measure of quality. Shows get canceled before their time. Shows survive past their peak on inertia. Numbers can lie in both directions, but when a show loses 2.25 million viewers between its peak and its final seasons, when that loss accelerates rather than steadies out, and when the timing of that loss lines up with specific creative decisions rather than general platform trends, the numbers are telling a story. They are just telling it quietly, in data points that most people never looked at directly. What those numbers describe is a show that peaked creatively and commercially at the same moment, the season 4 premiere, and then spent the next 4 years in a slow descent that nobody at the top explicitly acknowledged while it was happening. J.G. Quintel said in a 2017 interview that by the middle of season 7, he started to realize the show was getting picked up for fewer episodes than before, and that he had always told the network to let him know if they were ready to end it. He wanted to end it properly rather than be caught off guard. That is a creator who could feel the ground shifting under his feet, even if he couldn't stop it. The number that sits at the center of all of this is 3.047 million. That was the summit. Everything else is the story of how the show came down from it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Here is the thing that makes all of those viewership numbers more interesting and more specific. They were not pulled down by one bad episode or one bad arc in isolation. The decline was built out of smaller pieces, decisions that each seemed reasonable on their own, but added up to something the audience could feel even before they could name it. The most visible of those decisions was what happened to the writing room and the people inside it between season 3 and season 8. Section 2. The writer turnover. After season 3, the creative core broke apart. Regular show was built by a specific group of people, in a specific way, at a specific moment in time. Understanding what the show lost across its 8 seasons requires understanding what it had at the beginning, and that starts with how J.G. Quintel put the team together in the first place. Quintel graduated from the California Institute of the Arts, a school in Santa Clarita that has produced a significant portion of the people who make American animation. He studied there alongside Pendleton Ward, who went on to create Adventure Time. He worked on The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack at Cartoon Network before Regular Show existed. When he pitched Regular Show in 2008 using a storyboard rather than a verbal description, because, as he later said, explaining the concept out loud would have made no sense to anyone, and got the green light, he made a specific hiring decision. He recruited indie comic book artists to build the show's staff. Their visual style matched what he wanted the show to look like, and more importantly, their sensibility matched what he wanted the show to feel like. These were people who made things because they found them funny, not people following a formula someone else had established. That group became the creative foundation of seasons 1, 2, and 3. Those 3 seasons are consistently ranked as the high point of the show by fans, by critics, and by the people who worked on the show itself. They are the seasons that defined what Regular Show was. The absurd escalation from nothing, the specific comic timing, the way a conflict about borrowing $1 could end with someone fighting a supernatural entity from another dimension. The show's identity was baked in during those 3 seasons by those specific people. Then the departures began. Season 4 ran from October 2012 to August 2013. The Wikipedia page for that season documents something that, on its own, looks like a minor production note. Season 4 was the last season to feature contributions from Kat Morris. She left to work on Steven Universe. That single sentence matters more than it might appear, because Kat Morris was not a minor contributor. She was one of the storyboard artists whose work defined the visual and comedic language of the early show. When she left, she took that sensibility with her to a different show at a different studio. She was not the only one. The departures that followed over the next 4 seasons were gradual enough that no single exit looked catastrophic, but the accumulation of them was significant. John Davis Infantino served as supervising director on 143 episodes from 2011 through 2015. That credit covers seasons 2 through most of season 6. He was one of the most consistent creative presences the show had. His departure after season 6 was one of the most significant losses the production experienced in its later years, even if it happened quietly and without any public announcement. 143 episodes is not a small number. That is the majority of the show's entire run, and his fingerprints were on most of the episodes that people point to when they talk about what regular show used to be. Sean Zealis served as supervising director for 59 episodes from 2013 to 2014, covering seasons 4 and 5. He was also a story writer across multiple seasons. His departure after season 5 removed another piece of the show's original creative structure. Then there is the specific case of J.G. Quintel himself, which is the detail that most people who discuss the show's decline tend to overlook entirely. The regular show wiki's entry on Quintel documents something straightforward and factual. He served as a storyboard artist for the show's first 3 seasons. He became a writer on the show during season 5. He remained on the writing team from season 5 through the finale in 2017. Read that again slowly. The man who created regular show, who conceived every character, who built the premise from his own student films and his own experiences as a young college dropout, who pitched it with a storyboard because the concept couldn't be explained in words. That man was a storyboard artist in the first 3 seasons, not a writer. He was making the show visually. He was in the room. He was shaping it. But the actual written content of those first 3 seasons came through the writing team, which included the original group he had assembled. Then in season 5, he moved to the writing team. This sounds like an upgrade. The creator is now more directly involved in the words being put on the page. That should mean the show gets more of what made it good, right? The reality is more complicated. By the time Quintel joined the writing team in season 5, several of the people who had built the show's voice alongside him were already gone or on their way out. The writing room he joined was not the same writing room that had produced the first 3 seasons. And simultaneously, he was moving away from the storyboard work that had been his most direct creative contribution to the show's identity in its peak years. The Qualitapedia documentation on seasons 5 and 6 puts it plainly. Many of the original writers from the first 3 seasons were fired or replaced, and Cartoon Network hired new writers who were not familiar with the show. That second part is the critical detail. The institutional knowledge of what made regular show work, the specific rhythm of its humor, the way it escalated, the particular kind of absurdity it deployed, lived in the people who had built it from the beginning. When those people left and new people came in, the new people were working from finished episodes as reference material, rather than from the inside understanding that comes from being in the room when things were figured out for the first time. This is not a criticism of the new writers as people or as professionals. Writing for an established show is genuinely hard. The challenge of walking into a writer's room that already has 5 seasons of material and being expected to produce something that sounds like it belongs in that world is enormous. The problem was structural. The pipeline that fed the show with writers who understood its DNA was broken, and the replacement pipeline produced something different. The result showed up on screen in specific ways. The Qualitapedia documentation identifies what happened to the show's comedy during seasons 5 and 6. The humor became less frequent, the jokes less sharp, and the moments that were meant to be funny went on longer than they needed to. The timing, which in seasons 1 through 3 had been one of the show's most reliable strengths, loosened. Episodes that should have been 11 minutes of tight absurdity started to feel like they were working harder to get to punchlines that landed softer. The formula that had felt fresh in season 1, Mordecai and Rigby try to get out of doing work, things escalate into something supernatural or dangerous, they survive, became legible in a way it hadn't been before. When a formula becomes legible, when the audience can see the shape of the episode before the episode has earned it, the show's ability to surprise disappears. The surprise had been one of regular show's most essential qualities. In seasons 1 and 2, episodes went places the audience genuinely could not predict. By season 6, the episodes were going places the audience had already been. This is directly connected to the writer turnover. The original group had not yet exhausted their ideas because they were still working from personal experience and genuine creative curiosity. The new writers were, by definition, working from someone else's established template. Template-based writing produces template-shaped episodes. There is also the specific case of season 8, which represents the most extreme version of the creative disruption that had been building since season 4. The Wikipedia article on season 8 documents that longtime character designer Ben Adams left the show after just the first 6 episodes of that final season to work on Billy Dilly's super-duper subterranean summer at Disney XD. Adams was replaced by Casey Herman Hermanson, who was new to the show. The character designer is the person responsible for how the show looks, how the characters move, how they're proportioned, how their expressions communicate emotion. Losing that person 6 episodes into the final season is not a small thing. The visual consistency that had been one of the show's hallmarks in its early years was, in the final season, being maintained by someone who had not been there for most of what that consistency was built on. The NPR profile of Regular Show from 2014 documented that a single episode of the show took 9 months to produce, from idea to finished product, and that the team usually had 20 episodes in production at once. That production timeline means the decisions being made about writers, directors, and designers in any given year would not fully show up on screen until a year or more later. The writer who left in 2013 would be missing from episodes that aired in 2014 and 2015. The institutional knowledge they took with them would be absent from the work that followed. When people say a show lost its spark, they are almost never able to point to the exact episode where it happened. The deterioration feels gradual and somewhat shapeless, like something that was always there just isn't anymore. The reason for that is exactly this. The people who created the spark leave in a pattern that is spread out across multiple seasons and multiple departments, and the effect of their absence accumulates slowly rather than announcing itself all at once. Regular Show lost Kat Morris at the end of Season 4. It lost Sean Sealis after Season 5. It lost John Davis Infantino after Season 6. It lost Ben Adams 6 episodes into Season 8. Each of those departures in isolation looked manageable. Together they describe a show that was rebuilt from the inside out across 4 seasons, and the version that emerged at the end of that process shared the name and the characters of the original, but had a fundamentally different creative foundation holding it up. The show that premiered in 2010 was made by a tight group of people who had built something together from nothing. The show that ended in 2017 was made by a different group of people, working from a blueprint those original people had left behind. The blueprint was good. The original building was better. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes this particularly worth sitting with is that the writer turnover did not happen in a vacuum. It was accompanied, and in some ways accelerated, by a specific creative decision that changed what Regular Show was actually about for 2 full seasons. The show added a love triangle, and the love triangle broke something that the turnover had already weakened. Section 3, the romance arc, collapsed the show's formula. Seasons 5 and 6 became the Mordecai problem. Regular Show was never supposed to be a romance show. That is not a guess or an interpretation. The structure of the first 3 seasons makes it obvious. Mordecai had a crush on Margaret from the very first season. She worked at the coffee shop near the park. He liked her. He was bad at showing it. That was the extent of the romantic content in the early episodes, and it worked because it stayed small. It was one ingredient in a much larger recipe, and the show never let it take over the kitchen. Margaret existed in seasons 1 through 3 as a presence rather than a focus. Mordecai would embarrass himself trying to impress her. An episode would be built around that embarrassment. Then the supernatural disaster would arrive, Mordecai and Rigby would have to deal with it, and the Margaret stuff would get folded into the chaos rather than driving it. The show used the crush as a starting point for escalation, not as the point itself. That distinction is everything. Season 4 changed the balance. Mordecai and Margaret got closer. Episodes started building more directly toward their relationship. The arc moved slowly. J.G. Quintel acknowledged in a Nerdist interview that fans felt the relationship was, in his words, the slowest thing on the planet. But he explained that he wanted to make sure the show did not burn through the story too fast. He wanted to take advantage of every story the setup could produce. By the end of Season 4, they were a couple. Then Season 5 began, and Margaret left for college. The episode Stake Me Amadeus, the Season 4 finale, is where Mordecai asks Margaret to be his girlfriend, and she turns him down. She has been accepted to her dream college, Milton University, and she cannot give that up. She runs out of the restaurant crying. Mordecai is left heartbroken. The show had spent a season and a half building toward this relationship and then ended it before it really started. That decision created a structural problem that Seasons 5 and 6 never fully solved. With Margaret gone, the show needed somewhere to put Mordecai's emotional energy. The answer was CJ, a character who had appeared briefly in Season 3 in an episode called Yes, Dude, Yes. CJ is a humanoid cloud. When she gets angry or upset, she turns into a storm. She was a fun side character in her original appearance, memorable enough that the show brought her back, and in Season 5, she became Mordecai's new love interest. This is where the formula problem started. The Qualitapedia documentation on Seasons 5 and 6 identifies a repeating pattern that runs through most of the Mordecai-focused episodes in both seasons. The structure goes like this. Mordecai and other characters go somewhere, or Mordecai goes somewhere alone. Mordecai gets nervous because Margaret is either around or on his mind. Rigby gives him advice and tries to help him figure out his feelings. Something happens that either moves the situation forward or resets it. The episode ends. That pattern, in some variation, escalation repeats across dozens of episodes in seasons 5 and 6. Once the audience could see the shape of it, the episodes stopped being surprising. Regular show, in its best form, worked because the audience could never predict where an episode was going. The escalation was the point. A disagreement about a video game would become a life-or-death conflict with a supernatural entity, and the path from one to the other was always unexpected. In seasons 5 and 6, a significant portion of the show's episodes followed a path the audience had already walked multiple times. The comedy suffered for it. The Qualitypedia documentation notes that because the show was trying to build a continuous emotional story across episodes, the comedy got pushed aside in favor of moments and scenes that served the romance arc. The show was trying to do something it had never tried before: sustain an ongoing emotional narrative across a full season, and the infrastructure for doing that well was not in place. The writers who had been most responsible for the show's comedic timing had either left or were being asked to produce a different kind of content. The result was episodes that felt heavy in a way the early show never had. Fan communities registered this in real time. Forum threads from April 2014 on the anime superhero platform show viewers noting that the show had lost its comedic edge in favor of drama that did not always land. One commenter put it plainly: the characters in the later seasons were not as dull and correct as they had become. They were not making mistakes in the fun, chaotic way the early show had built its identity around. They were making mistakes in a more familiar, more grounded, more drama-focused way that felt like a different show wearing the regular show mask. Mordecai himself changed during this period in a way that the show never fully reckoned with on screen. In seasons 1 through 3, Mordecai was irresponsible in a specific and coherent way. He and Rigby skipped work to play video games. They made bad decisions because they were young and lazy and not thinking about consequences. Their chaos was mostly self-generated and mostly funny. The show understood what kind of character Mordecai was, and it built episodes around that understanding. By season 5, and especially by season 6, Mordecai's primary characteristic had become indecision about women. He could not choose. He could not communicate. He could not stop making things worse with Margaret and CJ simultaneously. The Qualitypedia documentation describes this shift as flanderization, a term for when a character's personality gets reduced to one exaggerated trait that the show keeps returning to at the expense of everything else that made the character interesting. Mordecai's indecisiveness became so central to seasons 5 and 6 that it crowded out almost everything else about him. The Reset-era community thread on the show, archived from 2021, captures the audience's response to this. Multiple users in the thread noted they had moved from the Mordecai side of the show to the Rigby side during the middle seasons because Rigby's storylines remained more coherent and more consistent with what the show had originally been. The phrase that appears in the thread is telling. Someone describes jumping on the "Mordecai sucks, please more Rigby stories" bandwagon. That is not a small thing. When the audience starts actively rooting against a show's main character, the show has a structural problem. The love triangle that dominated season 6 made this worse rather than better. Margaret returned from college. She and Mordecai had unresolved feelings. CJ was Mordecai's girlfriend. The show positioned itself to generate drama from the collision of all three characters in the same space, and it did. But the drama it generated was consistently the kind that made Mordecai look bad, and the show did not seem to know what to do with that. The episode 1000th Chopper Flight Party is a good example of how the love triangle played out across season 6. CJ tells Mordecai to go to a party at Margaret's parents' house and enjoy himself. He promises to save her cake. At the party, he ends up in a helicopter with Margaret and her parents because her father insists. CJ shows up unexpectedly. She sees Mordecai in the helicopter having a good time with Margaret and her family. Mordecai tries to get her attention so she does not get the wrong idea, stands up too fast, and falls into Margaret's lap. CJ sees this. She is hurt. The situation is a mess that Mordecai did not create intentionally, but also did not handle well. That is a reasonable depiction of a complicated situation. Real relationships have moments like that. The problem is that the show kept returning to versions of that same scenario. Mordecai does something clumsy around Margaret. CJ sees it or hears about it. The relationship is damaged further, without giving Mordecai enough scenes where he handled things well or grew in a visible way. The accumulation of those moments across season 6 turned him into a character the audience was watching make the same mistakes on a loop. The CJ character also took damage from this arc in a way that the show did not fully address. CJ was, by fan consensus across multiple platforms, a well-liked character. The Reset-era thread on the show has multiple users noting that CJ was too good for Mordecai, that he did her wrong, and that her exit from the show left them less interested in following his story. She was voiced by Linda Cardellini, a recognizable and skilled performer, and the character had a specific and appealing design. A humanoid cloud who turns into a storm when she is upset is a visual metaphor that the show used effectively in her best episodes. Watching that character get ground down by a love triangle that the show could not find a graceful resolution for was not a satisfying experience for the audience that had invested in her. Matt Price, the show's story editor and a writer across multiple seasons, Ross, confirmed after the show ended that the writing room disagreed about how to resolve the Margaret situation. In his words, he personally wanted Margaret to eventually get together with a character named Don, Rigby's older brother, because he thought they had both missed Mordecai and Rigby during the Dome arc and could have comforted each other in that time. He noted that no one else in the writer's room agreed with him. That specific detail reveals something important about where Season 6 went wrong. The writing room was not unified on what the arc was building toward. When a group of writers cannot agree on where a story is going, the episodes that come out of that disagreement tend to feel uncertain and directionless, because they are. The viewership data reflects the damage. Season 6's most watched episode drew 2.241 million viewers. Its least watched episode drew 1.383 million viewers. The gap between the best and worst performing episodes in a single season, 858,000 viewers, is enormous. That kind of spread suggests an audience that was tuning in selectively rather than consistently, watching the episodes that sounded interesting and skipping or drifting away from the ones that looked like more of the same romantic drama. Season 6 is consistently ranked as the worst season in the show's run by the fan community. The IMDb user ranking of regular show seasons puts it near the bottom. The Qualitapedia documentation calls it the lowest point of the series. These assessments align with what the viewership numbers show and with what the writing history explains. A show built on surprise and escalation spent 2 seasons on a romance arc that repeated the same emotional beats without escalating them, handled by a writing room that had lost many of the people most responsible for the show's original voice, and it produced the weakest 2-season stretch in the show's history as a direct result. None of this happened because the show stopped caring. J.G. Quintel described the relationship arc in interviews as an attempt to portray something real, the specific awkwardness of being young and bad at communicating feelings. He said that Mordecai making poor decisions was intentional, and that when it was painful to watch, that meant it was, in his words, a little too real. The intention was honest. The execution, across 2 full seasons, was something the audience could feel was not working even when they could not always say exactly why. The romance arc was a creative bet that did not pay off, and the show that came out the other side of it, in Season 7, was trying to recover from 2 years of declining audiences, reduced creative continuity, and a main character the fans had turned on. The way it tried to recover, by putting the entire cast under a dome and then sending them into space, raised a different and more fundamental question about what regular show actually was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before the dome and the space arc, there was one specific episode that brought all of the Season 6 problems to a head in a single half hour, and did it in the most public and irreversible way possible. Section 4, Quote 1. When the show broke its own character. There is one episode in regular show's entire run that the creative team, the fan community, and the viewership numbers all agree on in the same direction. Not because it is the worst episode the show ever produced. It is not, by any technical measure. The animation is fine, the voice performances are fine, the side plot about Muscle Man getting married is genuinely sweet. But dumped at the altar, the Season 6 finale that aired on June 25, 2015, is the episode where every problem the show had been accumulating across 2 seasons arrived at the same time, and in the same place, and the result was an episode that damaged the show in ways that took until the finale to even partially address. The setup going into the episode is this. Muscle Man and Starla are getting married. This has been building since Season 3, when Muscle Man proposed to Starla in The End of Muscle Man. The wedding itself should be the emotional centerpiece of the episode. 2 characters the audience had watched for years finally getting to their happiest moment. The show had earned that payoff. The audience showed up expecting to feel good about it. What happened instead was that the episode made Mordecai's love triangle the main story and pushed Muscle Man's wedding into the background. Going into the wedding, Mordecai and CJ are still technically together, but the relationship is badly damaged. Margaret had returned in Season 6 and admitted to CJ that she still had feelings for Mordecai. This put Mordecai in an impossible position. He was with CJ, he had unresolved history with Margaret, and the show had spent most of Season 6 watching him fail to handle either situation cleanly. By the time the wedding arrives, Mordecai and CJ are on tense but functional terms. They are both at the wedding. Margaret is also at the wedding. During the ceremony, Mordecai is asked to give a toast. He stands up in front of everyone, and instead of toasting Muscle Man and Starla, he uses the moment to talk about his own feelings and his own confusion about his relationship. He does not explicitly break up with CJ during the speech. He does not explicitly choose Margaret. He stands up at his friend's wedding, in front of all of their friends, and expresses that he does not know who his soulmate is. CJ is in the room watching this happen. The TV Tropes recap of the episode documents what follows precisely. CJ cuts Mordecai off before he can finish. She tells him to save it because she already knows what he is going to say. She gives back the charm bracelet he had given her in the Season 5 finale, Real Date, the bracelet that had been the symbol of them becoming an official couple. She runs off crying. Later in the episode, after things have calmed down, Mordecai and CJ say goodbye to each other in a way that is described as amicable. Mordecai tells Rigby they are taking a break for a while. Rigby's response to Mordecai in that moment is one of the clearest lines the show ever delivered about what had just happened. He asks Mordecai, roughly, when he told him to go with his gut, did he here completely lose his mind and try to dump his girlfriend at a wedding? Mordecai responds by putting his face in his hands and saying he is no good at this stuff. The IMDb user reviews for the episode are consistent in what they identify as the problem. Multiple reviewers note that Mordecai hijacked one of his closest friends' weddings to make it about his own relationship drama. One review calls it Mordecai's worst episode in the entire series. The sentiment that CJ deserved better than what Mordecai did to her runs through the fan response across multiple platforms. Muscleman himself calls Mordecai out during the episode. So does Starla. The wedding guests are watching all of this unfold. The show is not trying to present Mordecai's behavior as acceptable. It knows the speech was wrong, and it has other characters say so. But the fact that the show knew the behavior was wrong and depicted it anyway, without giving Mordecai a clear path to growth or redemption within the episode, left the audience with nowhere to put their frustration. He does something bad. People tell him it was bad. He agrees it was bad. Nothing is resolved. CJ is gone. The Qualitypedia documentation on the episode identifies something specific about what Muscleman's wedding was supposed to accomplish. The wedding had been set up across 3 seasons. By the time it arrived, it should have been a payoff episode, a moment where the show rewarded the audience for following these characters for years. Instead, the wedding became a backdrop for a Mordecai storyline that had already worn out its welcome by the time the episode aired. Muscleman and Starla do get married by the end of the episode, but the emotional weight that should have been entirely theirs gets divided and diluted. The Qualitypedia documentation also notes something about the episode's impact beyond the story itself. In its assessment of what went wrong in Season 6, it states directly that Dumped at the Altar affected the ratings, lowered views across the world, and reduced Cartoon Network's faith in the series. That is a significant claim. A season finale that was supposed to send the audience into hiatus wanting to come back instead appears to have pushed some portion of that audience away. The confirmed viewership numbers for Season 7 support this reading. The highest-rated episode of Season 7, the Dome Experiment Special, drew 1.597 million viewers. That is the best Season 7 managed. The Season 6 finale that preceded it, the episode that was supposed to make the audience eager for what came next, drew viewers in a range that had already been declining. And the season that followed it posted numbers the show had never seen that low before. The audience that walked away from Dumped at the Altar did not fully come back. There is also what happened after the show ended that makes this episode feel more significant in retrospect. J.G. Quintel gave an interview to Animation Magazine in February 2017, shortly after the finale aired. In that interview, he addressed the Margaret and CJ situation directly. His words are worth sitting with carefully. He said he knew there were 2 camps of fans, people who liked Margaret and people who liked CJ, and that with the way the story played out, it felt like Mordecai had messed it up for both of them. He said there was no way he could get either of them back. He said it turned into a situation where, for Mordecai, the true reality was that he had learned from his mistakes and needed to move on. That explanation is honest. The problem is that the learning and the moving on happened in the finale, after the damage was done. The audience had watched Mordecai make the same mistakes across 2 full seasons, and the resolution to those mistakes, him eventually becoming a successful artist and marrying a completely new character named Steph, who had never appeared in the show before, was delivered as a flash-forward epilogue in the series finale. 2 seasons of painful, repetitive drama paid off in a brief scene at the end of the last episode. Matt Price, the story editor, confirmed after the show ended that CJ basically cut all ties with Mordecai and everyone else after the breakup. Not just with Mordecai, with the entire group. The regular show wiki documents his statement. She and Mordecai never reconciled. She stopped talking to all of them. That confirmation came after the show was over, and it reframes what the audience had been watching. A character who had been a significant presence in seasons 5 and 6, voiced by Linda Cardellini, was written out of the show's world so completely that the producers confirmed she had no contact with any of the main cast for the rest of their lives. That is not a soft exit. That is a permanent removal. The episode also did something to Rigby that is easy to miss because the focus is so heavily on Mordecai. In Dumped at the Altar, Rigby tells Mordecai that he and Eileen have been dating for 3 months. This is a reveal that the show drops almost as a side note in the middle of all the Mordecai drama. Rigby and Eileen becoming a couple is a significant moment. Rigby had spent seasons being dismissive of Eileen's obvious feelings for him, and his gradually warming up to her had been one of the quieter and more genuine character arcs in the show's run. Dropping the reveal of their relationship in the middle of an episode that is overwhelmed by Mordecai chaos meant that a payoff the audience had been building toward for years got treated as a footnote. The show knew this. The writers knew this. In the Season 7 and Season 8 arcs that followed, Rigby's relationship with Eileen and his return to high school to get his diploma drama became the emotional spine of those seasons in a way that felt like the show trying to correct course after the Mordecai years. Rigby's arc in seasons 7 and 8 is consistently rated more positively by fans than anything the show did with Mordecai during the same period. That contrast is not accidental. Rigby had been given a clear goal: finish high school, prove himself, grow up, and the show pursued that goal without the recursive drama that had plagued the Mordecai storylines. But the correction came too late for season 6. Dumped at the Altar closed a chapter of the show that had cost the show 2 seasons of declining quality and a measurable portion of its audience. The fans who had invested in CJ as a character felt that investment had been wasted. The fans who had always preferred Margaret felt that her arc had been strung along and then resolved off-screen. The fans who had simply wanted the show to go back to being funny about 2 animal park workers getting into supernatural trouble had spent 2 seasons waiting for that to happen and were still waiting. What came next? The Dome in season 7, the space arc in season 8, represented the show's attempt to put the romance era behind it and return to something bigger and more purely adventurous. Whether that attempt worked is a separate question. What is not separate is why the attempt had to be made in the first place, and who was responsible for the 3 seasons that made it necessary. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the person who ended up carrying the most weight for all of those problems was not the one who created them. A character had been introduced in season 4 with the explicit purpose of adding something new to the show's cast. He had been present for 3 seasons, appeared in dozens of episodes, and then been revealed to be something completely different from what the audience had been led to believe. And then, almost immediately, he was gone. Written out of the show so completely that his last major scene had him sitting on a submarine watching the park blast into space. His name was Thomas, and what the show did with him is one of the clearest examples of a writer's room introducing something without knowing what it actually wanted to do with it. Section 5. Thomas. 3 seasons of setup, 1 episode of payoff, then gone. Thomas first appeared in Exit 9B, the season 4 premiere that also happened to be the most watched episode in the show's entire history. 3 million people saw him show up for the first time. He was a goat. He wore a gray t-shirt, brown pants, and red and white sneakers. He was introduced as a college-age intern coming to the park to earn academic credit. He was voiced by Roger Craig Smith, a professional voice actor with significant credits. His arrival was treated as a genuine addition to the cast. Not a one-episode character, not a joke that would be forgotten the following week, but a new face who is going to be part of the park crew going forward. In Exit 9B, Thomas actually does something meaningful. The episode involves a villain trying to take over the park by resurrecting every enemy Mordecai and Rigby had ever faced. Thomas, in his very first appearance, plays a critical role in saving the park from being taken over. He is not just standing in the background. He contributes to the resolution of the episode. For a brand new character introduced in the premiere of a new season, that is a strong debut. The audience had a reason to pay attention to him. The episode immediately after, called Starter Pack, introduces one of the show's running bits involving Thomas. Muscle Man gives him the starter pack, a hazing ritual the show had established as something the veteran park workers do to new people. The starter pack involves a series of pranks and unpleasant tasks designed to test whether the new person can handle being part of the group. Thomas goes through it. He survives it. By the end of Starter Pack, he has been accepted into the park crew in the way the show's established characters accept people, grudgingly, through shared chaos, without anyone saying so directly. That is a solid foundation for a character. He had an introduction, a test, a result, and a place in the ensemble. The natural expectation was that the show would build on all of that in the episodes that followed. What actually followed was considerably less than that. Thomas appeared across seasons 4, 5, and 6 in a recurring role that was consistent in one specific way. He almost never did anything that mattered. He was in episodes. He stood with the group during crowd scenes. He occasionally had a line. In season 5, an episode called Thomas Fights Back gave him a moment of genuine contribution. He recovered the park statue from a rival park manager named Jin, and the other park workers acknowledged him for it. That episode was the closest the show came to doing something real with the character after his debut. It aired in season 5, and then the show moved on from it almost immediately. The regular show Wiki's entry on Thomas documents something that the creator himself confirmed. Thomas was not conceived as a spy from the beginning. That detail is not a fan theory or a reading of the text. Quintel stated it directly. The spy storyline, which became the central and defining feature of the character's entire arc, was not the original plan. It was added later as a way to explain and resolve a character the show had introduced without knowing what to do with him. That retroactive decision produced The Real Thomas, a season 6 special that recontextualized everything the audience thought they knew about the character across 3 seasons. The special reveals that Thomas's real name is Nikolai. He was born in Kiev, abandoned by his parents, and adopted by Russia, which raised him as a spy. His entire identity as a park intern, the easygoing personality, the eagerness to help, even the mother he had brought to the the Thanksgiving special was a cover. The mother was a robot who could use ventriloquism. Everything about Thomas, across 3 seasons, had been performance. The twist is executed competently on a scene-by-scene level. Thomas, confronted with his mission and the reality of what completing it would mean for the people at the park, chooses to betray his Russian handlers, rather than go through with a plan that would get the park workers killed. His loyalty, the show argues, had become real, even if his identity was fake. He had genuinely come to care about the people at the park, and that feeling was stronger than the mission he had been raised to carry out. By the end of the special, he has saved the park and gone into hiding, knowing he cannot stay. On paper, that is a complete story. Character is introduced, character develops relationships, character faces a crisis that tests those relationships. Character chooses connection over mission. That is a recognizable and functional story structure. The problem is what came before it and what came after it. What came before it was 3 seasons of Thomas doing almost nothing. The spy reveal was supposed to reframe all of those low-key appearances. The show was arguing that his passivity and his generic intern behavior had been intentional, part of the cover. But a reframe only works if the original material rewards being looked at again through the new lens. When the audience went back and thought about Thomas across seasons 4 and 5, what they found was not hidden depths or subtle spy behavior. They found a character who had been written as a placeholder because the show did not have a plan for him yet. The regular show wiki documents the fan response to Thomas's absence after the real Thomas. Quote, "The fans complained, 'What is this replacement?' The complaints were about the fact that after 3 seasons of building a character to the point of a major reveal, the show removed him from the cast almost immediately. Thomas's last significant appearance is in Guys Night 2, a season 7 episode. After that, he appears as a visual cameo in Rigby's graduation day special, sitting on a Russian submarine, watching the park blast into space, raising his drink in farewell. That is his goodbye, a silent cameo, a raised drink, gone." The character who was introduced in the show's highest-rated episode, who had been part of the cast for 3 full seasons, who had a dramatic reveal that changed the audience's understanding of everything they had watched him do, got a background shot on a submarine as his final scene. There is no conversation. There is no moment where the park crew acknowledges what he did for them. There is no closure for a character who had, within the story's own logic, risked his life and his mission to save people he had come to care about. Margaret's letter, referenced in show documentation, mentions that Thomas wound up owning a video store in Montreal, Canada, that only rented spy movies. That detail is delivered as a written note rather than a scene. The audience does not see it. It is a piece of information, not a moment. The structural failure here is specific. Regular show added Thomas to the cast in season 4 because the show was growing and the writers wanted to expand the ensemble. That is a reasonable creative decision. Shows add characters. Ensembles evolve. The failure was in the execution of that expansion across the 3 seasons that followed. Thomas was kept in the background for so long, given so little to do, that by the time the real Thomas arrived with its big spy revelation, a significant portion of the audience had already stopped expecting anything meaningful from him. The TikTok documentation around Thomas confirms this. A single video describing him as the definition of wasted potential accumulated 398,500 likes. That number is a direct measurement of how many people in the show's audience felt the same way about the character, that the setup had promised something and the delivery had not matched it. That feeling is not based on the spy twist being a bad idea in concept. The spy twist is actually a reasonable idea. A character who had been quietly observing the park crew for 3 seasons, turning out to have been there for a covert purpose, is the kind of reversal regular show's surreal sensibility could have made something genuinely interesting out of. The gap between what the idea could have been and what it became is the problem. If Thomas had been planned as a spy from the beginning, the show could have planted real clues across 3 seasons, moments that seemed like normal intern behavior but gained new meaning once the reveal arrived. The real Thomas could have been an episode where the audience watched it and immediately wanted to go back and look at his earlier appearances differently. Instead, because the creator confirmed the spy angle was added later, the earlier appearances cannot be reread as anything other than what they appeared to be at the time. There are no hidden clues because there was no plan for there to be any. This matters for the larger story of the show's decline, because Thomas represents something beyond his own arc. He represents a pattern that became more visible as the show went on, the introduction of elements without a clear destination for them. The show added Thomas to season 4 without knowing what Thomas was. It added the love triangle to seasons 5 and 6 without a unified plan for how to resolve it. It added the dome to season 7 and sent the cast to space in season 8 because, as Quintel himself said, the idea had started presenting itself and eventually became part of their story. The show was making decisions reactively rather than planning them in advance. And the Thomas arc is the clearest example of what reactive storytelling looks like when it runs across 3 seasons and ends with a background cameo on a submarine. There is also something specifically sad about what Thomas's exit meant meant for the show's ensemble. Regular show had always been strongest when its full cast was functioning as a unit. The early seasons worked because Mordecai, Rigby, Benson, Skips, Pops, Muscleman, and High Five Ghost all had defined roles and relationships that the show could draw on in any combination. Thomas was supposed to add to that ensemble. He was supposed to give the show a new dynamic to play with. After 3 seasons of being underused and 1 special of being dramatically revealed and then removed, he left the ensemble smaller and the dynamic unchanged. The show had spent 3 seasons worth of screen time on a character who, by the end, had made almost no lasting impact on any of the remaining characters or their relationships. His departure happened at the same time the show was also dealing with the fallout from the Mordecai and CJ breakup. Season 7 began with the cast minus Thomas and minus any clear romantic future for Mordecai, facing a dome that had been placed over the park by a group of scientists. The show was trying to move past 2 seasons of romantic drama and the removal of a 3-season character simultaneously, and it chose to do both by replacing the familiar park setting, the physical location that had been the anchor of the show since the first episode, with a contained science experiment, and then, eventually, with outer space. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Whether that choice represented a genuine creative vision or a desperate attempt to shake the show out of the hole it had dug itself into is the question that sits at the center of the final 2 seasons. And there was one person whose feelings about the space arc were documented clearly and honestly in an interview. The person who made the decision to go there in the first place. Section 6. J.G. Quintel admitted the space arc was a shark jump he feared making. There is a specific kind of creative decision that happens to long-running shows when the people making them can feel the ground shifting. The show has been going for several seasons. The original premise has been stretched in every direction it can reasonably go. The audience is still there, but not in the numbers it used to be. The network wants more episodes. The writers are running out of the kind of ideas that made the show feel alive in the first place. And someone in a room somewhere says something like, "What if we completely changed the setting?" For regular show, that moment arrived at the end of Season 7. The Season 7 finale, Rigby's graduation day special, ends with the entire park, the physical building, the grounds, the trees, every character being launched into space. A rocket device fires. The park lifts off the ground. The crew is now in orbit. Season 8 would take place entirely in space, with the park floating through the universe inside what is essentially a small dome, and the characters navigating alien planets and cosmic threats instead of the suburban setting that had been the show's home since the first episode. This decision did not come from nowhere. The groundwork for it had been laid across Season 7, which introduced the Dome arc, a storyline where scientists placed a transparent dome over the park and began observing the crew as research subjects. The Dome arc was itself a significant departure from what the show had been in its early seasons. Regular show's original setting was the park, which was grounded in a recognizable world, even when the things happening in it were completely surreal. The park felt real because it looked real. A gumball machine boss, a Yeti groundskeeper, and a ghost who wore a hand on his head all existed in a space that had grass and trees and a parking lot and a snack bar. The supernatural elements escalated out of something familiar. That contrast between the mundane setting and the insane events was one of the show's core creative engines. The Dome removed that contrast. Once scientists had placed a giant transparent bubble over the park and the crew was living inside it like specimens in an experiment, the setting had already stopped being the normal world the show had built its identity around. The space arc in Season 8 was the logical endpoint of that removal. If the park could exist under a dome, it could exist in space. But logical endpoints are not always good ones. J.G. Quintel was asked about the space decision in an interview with comicbook.com that ran around the time Season 8 premiered. His answer is one of the most honest things he said publicly about the show's final years. He described how ideas start presenting themselves when a show has been running long enough. Thoughts about where else the characters could go, what else could happen to them. He said that sending them to space was one of those ideas. And then he said, in plain terms, that his initial reaction to the idea was that it was dumb. That word is doing a lot of work. The creator of the show, describing his first instinct about the defining creative decision of his show's final season, used the word dumb. He did not dress it up. He did not say it felt risky or unconventional or bold. He said it was dumb, and that he thought so immediately. He went on to explain how the idea moved from something he initially dismissed to something the show actually did. He described how the regular show movie, which had been released in 2015 and whose plot involved the characters discovering that their future selves had become space rangers, had introduced the possibility. The movie had shown a version of Mordecai and Rigby as adults who operated in space. That visual was in the audience's memory. When the show started moving toward the Dome arc in Season 7, the space idea started feeling less random and more like something that had been building. Quintel said he and the team eventually eventually felt that going to space was part of Mordecai and Rigby's story, that it had been set up by the movie and could be the natural endpoint of their journey. That reasoning is understandable. The movie had existed. The future Space Ranger versions of the characters had been shown on screen. There was something to point to. The space arc was not a completely random choice pulled from nowhere. But the gap between not completely random and genuinely earned is large, and the show's final season lived in that gap. In a separate interview with Animation Magazine from February 2017, conducted after the show had ended, Quintel was asked directly about the episodes that had not worked. He acknowledged that some episodes did not have that special spark. He specifically named an episode called Replaced, a Season 8 episode about Vincent, a character who temporarily replaces Mordecai and Rigby at the park, as one that, in his words, felt like we already did that before. He said there were episodes where you look at them and think, that feels like we already did that. A creator saying about episodes from his own final season that they felt like something the show had already done is a significant admission. Regular Show's entire identity in its best years had been built on the opposite of that feeling. The show's early episodes felt new in a way that was hard to explain. The escalation was so unexpected, the turns so specific, that the audience could never predict where an episode was heading. By Season 8, the creator himself was looking at finished episodes and recognizing the shape of things the show had done before. The production circumstances of Season 8 made this harder to avoid. The Wikipedia article on Season 8 documents that character designer Ben Adams left the show after just the first 6 episodes to take a job at Disney XD. He was replaced by Casey Hermanson. The writing team for Season 8 included Benton Connor, Madeline Querapel, Casey Crowe, Owen Dennis, Minty Lewis, Ryan Pequin, Sam Spina, Gideon Chase, Alex Klein, and a newcomer named Sean Glaze. The story writers were Quintel, Sean Zelis, Gina Ippolito, Patrick Baker, and Matt Price. Calvin Wong served as supervising director. That is a large group, but the show was being made in a space setting that required the writers to produce alien planets, cosmic threats, and space-based adventures in an 11-minute format that had originally been built for suburban surrealism. The specific creative muscle that Regular Show had developed over 7 seasons, the ability to take something small and mundane and escalate it into something impossible, was less applicable in a setting where everything was already extraordinary. When the characters are floating through space and landing on alien planets as their normal Tuesday, the escalation has nowhere to go from the starting point. The starting point is already at the level where Regular Show's early episodes used to peak. The Season 8 episode list reflects this. Episodes like Space Creds, in which Mordecai and Rigby want to buy hover boots but do not have enough currency, and Lost and Found, in which the crew needs to retrieve a wallet on a dangerous planet, are recognizable Regular Show premises in their basic structure. The characters want something small, complications arise. But they are happening in space, surrounded by alien environments, which means the show has to spend energy establishing the setting before it can build the story. The 11-minute format that had worked perfectly for escalating a suburban dispute into a supernatural battle was being used to contain entire alien worlds and intergalactic stakes. Something had to be compressed, and what got compressed was usually the character work and the comedy. The viewership numbers for Season 8 follow the pattern established in Season 7. The show was airing in a time slot and a format that made direct comparison to earlier seasons difficult, but the trajectory was consistent. The audience that had once numbered 3 million was a fraction of that size. The show had found its ending, and the ending was being watched by far fewer people than had been there at the beginning. Quintel said something in the Animation Magazine interview that is worth holding on to. He described the production of Regular Show as an insane amount of time. He said he remembered people telling him when the show started that it was going to be a lot of work, and that he had responded with, "Yeah, that's cool." He described needing a break after the show ended and wanting to make another television show afterward. There is tiredness in that description. Not resentment, not bitterness, but the specific exhaustion of someone who had been doing something very hard for a very long time and was ready to stop. That exhaustion matters because it was shared by the writers' room. Making 20 or more 11-minute episodes per season across 8 seasons with a 9-month production pipeline for each episode is an enormous sustained effort. The NPR profile of the show from 2014 documented that the team usually had 20 episodes in production simultaneously. That is 20 separate stories in various stages of development at any given moment. Sustaining that output while also maintaining the creative freshness that made the show special in the first place is genuinely difficult, and the difficulty compounds with each passing season. By Season 8, the show had produced somewhere in the range of 244 episodes. Quintel said in the comicbook.com interview that by the time the final seasons arrived, the team was at the point where they were saying they cannot do that. They already did that. The well of original ideas that had felt bottomless in Seasons 1 and 2 had been drawn from for 8 years, and the space setting, which was supposed to open up new creative territory, was instead revealing how much of the show's original energy had been been tied to the specific setting of the park and the specific kinds of problems that setting could generate. The Dome arc in Season 7 and the Space arc in Season 8 were both attempts to solve the same problem by changing the scenery. The problem was that the show had run out of the kind of momentum that had made it feel alive. Changing the scenery can work for some shows. Putting familiar characters in unfamiliar settings can generate new energy if the characters themselves are still the engine of the story. But regular shows' characters had been changed significantly by the Mordecai years. Mordecai was recovering from 2 seasons of romantic drama and a broken relationship. Thomas was gone. The ensemble that arrived in space in Season 8 was not the same ensemble that had made the park feel like a place worth caring about in Seasons 1 through 3. Quintel's admission that he initially thought the space arc was dumb is honest in a way that most television creators are not willing to be about their own work. He said it was dumb. He then explained how he talked himself into it, how the movie had set it up, how it became part of the story they decided to tell. But the initial instinct was clear. Something in him recognized, before the decision was made, that sending a show about 2 park workers into space was a fundamental departure from what the show had always been. He made the decision anyway, and Season 8 is the result of that decision. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What Season 8 also produced, despite all of its problems, was the finale. And the finale's resolution of Mordecai's romantic arc, specifically the choice to have him end up with a character no one had ever seen before, a Batwoman artist named Steph, raised a question that the creative team addressed directly in interviews after the show ended. Their answer revealed something about how the show had understood its own mistakes, and what it thought it could do about them, even after everything had already been said and done. Section 7. The finale's resolution retroactively questioned the show's entire romance arc. The series finale of Regular Show, an episode called A Regular Epic Final Battle, aired on January 16, 2017. It was a 3-part episode that served as the conclusion to the Season 8 space arc and the ending of the entire show. The main plot involved Pops, the gentle, childlike character who had been part of the park crew since the beginning, facing his evil twin brother Anti-Pops in a battle that would determine whether the universe continued to exist. The stakes were as high as the show had ever set them. The resolution involved Pops sacrificing himself to defeat Anti-Pops, and his death was treated with genuine weight. The finale then jumped forward 25 years to show what happened to every character after the park returned to Earth. That epilogue is where the romantic arc that had defined Seasons 4 through 6 received its final answer. Mordecai, in the 25-year flash forward, is shown as a successful artist living in New York City. He has a wife. Her name is Steph. She is a Batwoman. She and Mordecai have 3 children together. They appear briefly, as a family, in a warm and settled domestic image. Steph had never appeared in the show before this moment. She had not been mentioned. She had no history with any of the other characters. She existed only in this final scene, as evidence that Mordecai had eventually found someone and built a life with her. Margaret is not shown with Mordecai. CJ is not shown with Mordecai. Both of them are accounted for in the epilogue. Margaret is implied to have continued her journalism career, and CJ's fate is not shown on screen, but neither of them ended up with the character the show had spent 2 full seasons positioning at the center of a romantic storyline built around both of them. The creative team addressed this decision directly after the show ended, and their explanation is one of the most revealing things ever said publicly about what went wrong in Seasons 5 and 6. J.G. Quintel gave the explanation in his Animation Magazine interview from February 2017. He said that the Margaret and CJ story had been a very big part of the show for Mordecai, and that he knew it would be nice if they could make one of those relationships work at the end. But he also knew there were 2 camps of fans, people who wanted Margaret and people who wanted CJ, and that with the way the story had played out, it felt like Mordecai had messed things up with both of them. His words were direct. There was no way he could get either of them back. The show had written him into a corner so completely that the only available exit was a new character who had no connection to the previous drama. He then said something that functions as a quiet admission about the entire arc. He described Mordecai's situation as one where the true reality for the character was that he had learned from his mistakes and needed to move on. Learning from mistakes and moving on is a reasonable conclusion for a character to reach. The problem is the timeline. Mordecai spent Seasons 5 and 6 making the same mistakes repeatedly. The learning happened at the very end, in a flash forward that skipped over 25 years of his life. The audience watched the mistakes. They did not watch the learning. They were simply told, via a brief image of Mordecai with Steph and their children, that it had eventually happened. Matt Price, the story editor who worked on the show across multiple seasons, added a separate piece of information after the finale aired. The Regular Show wiki documents his statement. He confirmed that CJ had basically cut all ties with Mordecai and with everyone else in the park crew after the breakup. Not a temporary distance, a permanent severance. She stopped talking to all of them. Price's confirmation means that a character voiced by Linda Cardellini, who had been a significant presence across 2 seasons and who had been set up as Mordecai's most serious and developed romantic relationship, spent the remaining years of of the show's timeline, including the 3 years the crew was in space, having no contact with any of them. Price also shared what the writing room had discussed about how to handle the Margaret situation. He said that he personally had wanted Margaret to eventually get together with Don, Rigby's older brother, a character who had appeared in multiple episodes and who, according to Price's reasoning, had also missed Mordecai and Rigby during the Dome arc and could have formed a connection with Margaret through that shared experience. Price noted that no one else in the writer's room agreed with him and that the idea never happened. That detail matters because it confirms something that the finished episodes of Season 6 already suggested. The writing room did not have a unified vision for where the romantic arc was going. Different writers had different ideas about the resolution. The episodes that came out of that disagreement reflected the uncertainty at their center. They moved the story forward without moving it toward anything in particular, because the people making them had not agreed on what they were moving toward. The official statement from the writing room about the finale decision, also documented on the regular show wiki, laid it out plainly. The team felt that the Margaret and CJ story was complete, and that both characters were on their own paths already. They felt that Mordecai had moved on. He had left the park to pursue art, and they thought it would be interesting if he met someone while doing that. The statement then added a line that, in its casual directness, says more about the 2 lost seasons than any critical analysis could. The line was, "He was too wishy-washy with them." The creative team, in their official post-finale statement, described their own main character's behavior across seasons 5 and 6 using the phrase "too wishy-washy." That is not a celebration of a complex character arc. That is a mild and somewhat affectionate criticism of a character who spent 2 seasons being indecisive in ways the audience found increasingly frustrating. The people who made those seasons were, after the show was over, essentially agreeing with the audience's most consistent complaint about them. The word wishy-washy is also interesting because of what it does not say. It does not say that Mordecai's arc was intentionally tragic. It does not say the show was making a deliberate artistic point about the costs of emotional immaturity. It describes the behavior in the same terms a friend might use to describe someone they like but find mildly exasperating. Wishy-washy. Too indecisive. He messed it up with both of them. Now he is with Steph, and they seem happy. That framing retroactively defines what the audience was watching across seasons 5 and 6. They were watching a character be too wishy-washy for 2 seasons. The show knew this while it was happening. The characters around Mordecai called him out on it. Rigby gave him advice. His friends expressed frustration. But knowing it while depicting it and knowing what to do about it are different things. The show depicted Mordecai's indecision accurately and consistently. It could not figure out how to end it in a way that felt earned within the show's own emotional logic. So it ended it in a flash forward that resolved everything off-screen. The audience's response to the Steph reveal was divided in the way that the creative team had anticipated. The regular show fandom forum documented the reaction. Some fans felt the decision was honest. Mordecai had genuinely damaged his relationships with both Margaret and CJ beyond repair, and having him end up with someone new, rather than forcing a resolution with either of the women he had hurt, was more realistic than a tidy, romantic ending. Other fans felt that 2 seasons of romantic investment had been discarded in favor of a character who had no history with anyone, appeared for less than a minute of screen time, and whose relationship with Mordecai could not be shown or earned because the show was already over. Both reactions are understandable. The creative decision itself is defensible on its own terms. The problem is that the defensibility of the finale decision is entirely dependent on the quality of the seasons that preceded it, and those seasons are the weakest in the show's run by almost every available measure. If seasons 5 and 6 had handled the romantic arc in a way that felt purposeful and well-constructed, the finale's resolution might have landed as a meaningful statement about growth and moving on. Mordecai spent 2 seasons learning painful lessons, the finale would be saying, and the result of those lessons is this life he built with someone who came after all of it. That reading requires the painful lessons to have been worth the time the show invested in them. The audience's consistent verdict, reflected in viewership declines, in fan rankings, in the community responses across multiple platforms, and in the creative team's own post-finale candor, is that the 2 seasons did not justify the investment. The Mordecai arc across seasons 4 through 6 is also worth comparing to the Rigby arc across seasons 6 through 8, because the contrast between them makes the failure of the former more specific. Rigby's arc was built around a clear, simple goal. He had dropped out of high school, and he needed to go back and finish his diploma. That goal was introduced in season 6 through the episode The Eileen Plan, where Eileen shows a list of things she wanted to accomplish before turning 25. Rigby realizes she had wanted to marry a smart man. He decides to go back to high school to prove he is that person. That is a clear motivation with a clear destination. The audience knew what Rigby was working toward. The show could measure his progress in concrete terms. He either passed the classes or he did not. The emotional stakes were connected to something specific and achievable. By the time Rigby graduated in Rigby's graduation day special, superficial. The payoff felt earned because the build-up had been coherent and directed. Fans and critics consistently rate Rigby's arc in the show's final seasons more positively than anything the show did with Mordecai during the same period. The difference is structure. One arc had a destination. The other was searching for one across 2 seasons without finding it. The finale also resolved Rigby's relationship with Eileen in a way that felt proportional to the time the show had invested in it. The 25-year flash forward showed Rigby and Eileen married with 2 children. That image landed cleanly because the show had built toward it gradually and honestly. Rigby warming up to Eileen had been one of the most organic character developments in the entire run, and seeing it reach a happy conclusion felt like a reward for paying attention. The contrast with Mordecai ending up with Steph is stark. One relationship resolution was earned across multiple seasons. The other was delivered in a flash forward involving a character no one had ever met. Quintel's post-finale reflection included a line that, in its quiet way, captures the entire arc of what the show tried and where it fell short in its middle seasons. He said that because they had featured Margaret and CJ in so many episodes, it felt a little weird that they were not more represented at the end. He acknowledged the strangeness of the resolution even while explaining the reasoning behind it. 2 characters who had appeared across dozens of episodes, who had been positioned as central to the show's emotional life for 2 full seasons, whose departures from Mordecai's life had been painful and public. Those characters received epilogue fates delivered through a brief, written statement rather than anything shown on screen. The show ended. Mordecai was with Steph. Rigby was with Eileen. Pops was gone. The park was back on Earth. 25 years had passed. And sitting somewhere in the history of the show, between the 3 million viewers of the Season 4 premiere and the quiet ending of the final episode, were 2 seasons of romantic drama that the creative team themselves described, after it was all over, with the word wishy-washy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That word is where the honest reckoning with the middle of this show lives. But there is one more piece of the decline that has nothing to do with the writing room or the romantic arc or the space setting. There is the specific and measurable story of what happened to Mordecai as a character, not across a season or 2, but across the entire run of the show, and what that transformation reveals about the gap between what regular show was at its best and what it became by the time it ended. Section 8. Mordecai's Flanderization, from protagonist to punchline. In the first episode of regular show, Mordecai and Rigby are trying to get a raise so they can fix a hole in their bedroom wall. They find a magical keyboard that lets them do anything they want. Things spiral out of control immediately. The premise is simple, and the execution is fast. The episode moves from the ordinary problem to the supernatural disaster in under 4 minutes, and Mordecai is at the center of it as a recognizable kind of person. He is young, he is a little lazy, he is not malicious. He makes bad decisions because he is not thinking far enough ahead, and the show treats that quality as the engine of the story rather than as a character flaw to be examined and judged. That version of Mordecai, impulsive, funny, well-meaning but careless, is the version that made him work as a lead character in the early seasons. He was not a hero in any traditional sense. He did not have a goal he was working toward or a lesson he was trying to learn. He was a 23-year-old Blue Jay who wanted to play video games and avoid raking leaves, and the universe kept throwing impossible situations at him as a direct consequence of his own avoidance. The comedy came from the gap between how small his problems started and how enormous they became, and from the specific way Mordecai and Rigby navigated those enormous problems using the same instincts that had caused the problems in the first place. The character worked because the show understood exactly what kind of person he was and stayed consistent with that understanding. His friendship with Rigby was the center of everything. Their dynamic, Mordecai slightly more responsible, Rigby slightly more reckless, both of them fundamentally on the same team, gave the show an anchor that could hold through any amount of surreal escalation. No matter how strange the episode got, the audience knew who these 2 people were to each other, and that knowledge made the chaos feel safe rather than random. Then the show started changing what Mordecai was about. The shift began gradually in Season 4. The romantic arc with Margaret became more prominent. Mordecai's defining quality started migrating from his friendship with Rigby and his general avoidance of responsibility toward his feelings about Margaret and his inability to express them clearly. This was not an abrupt change. Season 4 still had plenty of episodes where Mordecai and Rigby were functioning as a unit and getting into the kind of trouble the show had been built on. But the balance was shifting, and it was shifting in one direction. By Season 5, the shift had become the dominant fact of Mordecai's character. The Qualitypedia documentation on Seasons 5 and 6 identifies what happened to him during this period with precision. It describes him as having been Flanderized, a word that comes from a Simpsons character named Ned Flanders, whose personality became more and more exaggerated and one-dimensional as that show went on. When a character is Flanderized, one trait gets turned up to maximum volume, while everything else about them gets quieter and quieter, until only that one trait is left. For Mordecai, the trait that got turned up was his indecisiveness possessiveness about women. By season 5, he had become, in the Qualitapedia documentation's description, a nervous, annoying, generic character who thought things over too quickly and had taken on the same kind of impulsive recklessness that had always been more Rigby's quality than his. The documentation also notes that he could treat Rigby badly during this period. His best friend, the person the show had established as his most important relationship, because his attention and emotional energy were being consumed by the romantic drama. That last detail is the most damaging one. The friendship between Mordecai and Rigby was the show's foundation. Everything else was built on top of it. When the show started producing episodes where Mordecai's treatment of Rigby became secondary to his feelings about Margaret or CJ, it was deprioritizing the relationship that had made the show matter in the first place. Audiences feel this kind of shift even before they can name it. Something that used to feel warm starts feeling colder. The show is still there, the characters are still there, but something at the center of it has moved. The Reset-era community thread on the show captured this in real-time fan language. Multiple users in the thread described the experience of watching Mordecai during the middle seasons as frustrating in a way that went beyond normal character flaws being depicted honestly. One user described jumping onto what they called the Mordecai sucks bandwagon during the middle seasons. Another described his behavior as making them feel like CJ deserved better than him. A third described him as the second biggest simp in animation, comparing him unfavorably to Morty from Rick and Morty. Those are strong reactions to a cartoon character. They are also reactions that the show, by its own admission, was generating deliberately. Quintel said in an interview that Mordecai making poor decisions was intentional, and that when it was painful to watch, that meant it was a little too real. The intention was to depict something authentic about being young and bad at relationships. The problem was duration. A character making the same painful mistakes for 2 seasons is not the same as a character making a painful mistake and learning from it. The first produces frustration, the second produces growth. The Daily Fandom's analysis of Quintel's portrayal of young adulthood through the show captures this distinction. The article notes that Mordecai was oftentimes too caught up in his own feelings that he would neglect the feelings of his loved ones. It notes that his blindness to his own issues truly cost him relationships in the end. It frames this as an intentional and realistic portrayal of how young people carry baggage from one relationship into another. That reading is generous and not wrong on its own terms. The show was depicting something real. Young people do carry baggage. Young people do make the same mistakes repeatedly before they figure out how to stop. But there is a difference between depicting something real and depicting it in a way that is compelling to watch across 2 full seasons of television. Real life contains many things that are accurate, but not interesting to observe at length. Mordecai's romantic failures were accurate in the way that watching anyone fail at the same thing over and over is accurate. The accuracy was not in question. The interest level was. The character's arc in the early seasons had produced a completely different emotional experience in the audience. In season 2, an episode called Do Me a Solid features Mordecai trying to work up the courage to ask Margaret to a movie. Rigby agrees to do 10 solids, favors, for Mordecai in exchange for Mordecai doing 1 solid for him. The solid Rigby eventually asks for is maximally embarrassing, and Mordecai has to choose between completing it in front of Margaret or letting Rigby down. The episode is built around Mordecai's feelings for Margaret, which is the same basic material the show would be using in seasons 5 and 6. The difference is that the early episode uses those feelings as the starting point for escalating comedy, rather than as the subject matter to be examined and re-examined. Do Me a Solid is funny. The Margaret material serves the comedy. In seasons 5 and 6, the relationship drama is the point rather than the fuel, and the comedy that had always been the show's primary mode gets pushed to the side in service of emotional beats that the writing room could not build toward a satisfying resolution. There is also the specific question of what happened to the Mordecai and Rigby friendship during the middle seasons, because the friendship's degradation is more subtle than the romantic drama and easier to miss on a first watch. In the early seasons, Mordecai and Rigby were in nearly every scene together. Their conversations drove the episodes. Their disagreements were funny because they were rooted in a genuine and well-established dynamic. Mordecai trying to be the more responsible one, Rigby resisting responsibility entirely. Both of them eventually ending up in the same ridiculous situation regardless of who started it. The show understood that their friendship was the audience's emotional entry point into every episode. By season 6, episodes were regularly being built around Mordecai's romantic situation in ways that required him to be separated from Rigby for significant stretches of the runtime. Mordecai would be dealing with Margaret or CJ. Rigby would be giving him advice, which put Rigby in a supporting role relative to Mordecai's story rather than an equal partner in a shared one. The balance of the central friendship had tilted, and the show had not replaced it with anything that carried the same emotional weight. Rigby's own arc across these seasons is instructive by contrast. The Reset-era thread and multiple fan community discussions consistently identify Rigby as the character whose development remained more coherent and more satisfying during the middle and later seasons. friends. His relationship with Eileen built slowly and organically. His return to high school in Season 7 gave him a clear purpose. His growth felt real because it was measured against something specific. He was a dropout who wanted to prove himself, and the show tracked that journey with the kind of consistent direction that Mordecai's arc was missing. The IMDb episode rating data for the show reflects this. The highest-rated episodes of the series cluster in Seasons 2, 3, and 4, before the romantic arc became dominant. The Season 6 episode, Dumped at the Altar, which is the peak of the Mordecai flanderization arc, and the episode where his behavior was most visibly damaging to the people around him, holds a moderate 8.1 rating, significantly below the show's best episodes, which score between 9.3 and 9.7. The fan-curated list of worst regular show episodes includes multiple Season 5 and Season 6 entries centered on the romantic drama, with some scoring as low as 6.8 on IMDb, which is very low for a show whose overall rating sits at 8.6. The specific episode Bad Portrait from Season 5 is interesting in this context. The episode is about Mordecai being asked to paint Benson's portrait and being unable to do it well. The Qualitopedia forum discussions from 2014 specifically cite Bad Portrait as the episode that caused one viewer to start noticing the Season 5 quality decline. On its surface, Bad Portrait is not a romantic drama episode. It is about Mordecai's artistic insecurity, but it is part of a pattern in Season 5 where Mordecai's inadequacies and anxieties became the primary subject of episodes rather than the starting point for escalating situations. The show had turned its lens inward on its main character's flaws, and the result was episodes that felt smaller and more constrained than the show at its best. The Qualitopedia documentation on Seasons 5 and 6 also identifies something about the voice of the show that changed during the Mordecai years. It notes that the voice acting, while still technically good, felt flat in some episodes, like the performers were working through material that did not give them the same energy the early scripts had. J.G. Quintel himself voices Mordecai. He said in an interview early in the show's run that he had to practice yelling because he rarely raises his voice in real life, and that Mordecai's easygoing nature came naturally to him. When Mordecai's material across Seasons 5 and 6 required Quintel to voice a character who was anxious, indecisive, and repeatedly in the wrong, material that was further from his own natural register, the performance was still there, but something in the ease of it had changed. By Season 7, the show was actively trying to move away from the version of Mordecai that Seasons 5 and 6 had built. The Dome arc, and eventually the Space arc, gave him larger external problems to deal with. The romantic drama was mostly resolved, or at least set aside. Mordecai in Season 8 is a more functional character than Mordecai in Season 6. He is not trapped in the same recursive romantic loop. He is dealing with alien threats and cosmic stakes alongside the rest of the crew. But the damage done to his characterization across 2 seasons had already shifted the audience's relationship with him, and that shift did not fully reverse. The finale's epilogue, showing him as a successful artist with a wife and 3 children, was a genuine attempt to give the character a satisfying ending. It worked on the level of closure. The audience could see that Mordecai had eventually grown into someone stable and happy. But the version of Mordecai who had been flanderized across Seasons 5 and 6 was not the version who got that happy ending. 25 years had passed. The character who struggled through the romantic drama and the character who appeared in the flash forward were connected by name and design, but the show could not show the journey between them. The journey was the part that had gone wrong, and the finale could not retroactively fix it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What it could do, and what the next section addresses, was show the audience what regular show looked like when Mordecai stopped being the center of the story, and what that shift revealed about the show's actual strengths, and where those strengths had always really lived. Section 9. The Season 4 premiere was the peak, and then the show chased its own success. There is a specific kind of pressure that comes with success, and it is different from the pressure that comes with failure. Failure tells you clearly that something is wrong and needs to change. Success tells you that whatever you just did worked, and the natural response to that message is to do it again. The problem is that the things that make something work the first time are often impossible to repeat exactly, because part of what made them work was that nobody had seen them before. The surprise was built into the newness. Once the newness is gone, the surprise is harder to manufacture, and the attempt to manufacture it is often what produces the feeling that a show has started chasing its own tail. Regular Show hit that moment on October 1st, 2012, when Exit 9B drew 3.047 million viewers and became the most watched episode the show ever produced. Everything that came after that number was, in some sense, a response to it. The show had reached its highest point. The question for every season that followed was how to stay there, or how to get back there, or how to produce something that justified being compared to what had gotten them there in the first place. The answer the show found across Seasons 5 through 8 was a series of escalating structural changes, longer arcs, more serialized storytelling, bigger emotional stakes, and eventually a complete change of setting. Each of those changes was a response to the feeling that the original formula had been exhausted, and each of them moved the show further from the specific qualities that had made the Season 4 premiere feel like a genuine event. To understand what made Exit 9B work, it helps to understand what it was built on. The episode was a Season 4 premiere, which meant it was arriving after 3 seasons of groundwork. The show had spent 3 seasons introducing and developing its cast, establishing the rules of its world, and building an audience that knew every character well enough to feel something when all of them were threatened simultaneously. Exit 9B worked partly because it was a payoff episode. Every villain Mordecai and Rigby had ever faced came back, which meant the episode was rewarding viewers for having watched every episode that preceded it. The show was cashing in on 3 seasons of accumulated storytelling, and the audience felt that. That kind of payoff can only happen once. The moment Exit 9B aired and gave the audience the satisfaction of seeing every previous villain return and be defeated, that specific type of episode was no longer available to the show. The show could not do Exit 9B again. Trying to recreate it would require waiting another 3 seasons for a new accumulation of villains, and by that point, the show would be 11 seasons old. What the show tried to do instead was find other ways to produce the same feeling of scale and consequence. The romantic arc in seasons 5 and 6 was an attempt to create emotional stakes that felt as significant as the action stakes of Exit 9B. The Dome arc in season 7 was an attempt to create a sustained narrative tension that gave every episode weight beyond its individual story. The Space arc in season 8 was an attempt to create a setting so different from anything the show had done before that the novelty itself would generate the kind of energy the early seasons had produced through a completely different mechanism. None of those attempts fully worked, and the viewership numbers reflect that across every season from 5 onward. But the numbers alone do not explain why the attempts failed. The explanation lives in what made the early seasons work in a way that the later seasons could not replicate, regardless of the mechanism they chose. Regular Show, in seasons 1 through 3, was built on a specific kind of freedom. J.G. Quintel described this in his Squiggly interview, where he talked about the creative environment at Cartoon Network during the show's early years. He said that whatever the team came up with, the network was always up for them making an episode about it. He said they were never told that something was too weird or too extreme. He said the network was very supportive of any idea they came up with and helped them get it to the end. That level of creative freedom, for a first-time showrunner working with a team of indie comics artists who had been hired specifically because their sensibility matched the show's, produced something that felt genuinely unconstrained. The early episodes feel free in a way that is almost impossible to describe precisely, but very easy to recognize. An episode about trying to get tickets to a concert turns into a coffee-fueled nightmare that nearly kills everyone. An episode about a broken television turns into a Portal adventure. An episode about a bet between Mordecai and Rigby turns into a journey through a video game world that threatens to erase them from existence. The connections between the ordinary starting point and the extraordinary destination are always specific and always surprising. And the surprise was real because the people making the show were genuinely discovering where each episode was going as they made it. That discovery process is what the Squiggly interview captures when Quintel says he was amazed that the network greenlit some of what they were doing, that some of it was so weird, and it was just making them laugh. The show was being made by people who were entertaining themselves first and trusting that the audience would follow. That trust in their own instincts, in their own sense of humor, in the idea that what made them laugh would make other people laugh too, is the quality that is hardest to maintain as a show becomes more successful and the pressure to repeat that success increases. The NPR profile from 2014 documented the scale of the Operation Regular Show had become by its 5th season. The team had grown to around 40 people. 20 episodes were in production simultaneously. Each episode took 9 months to complete. The show had won an Emmy. It had produced merchandise. It had action figures and video games. J.G. Quintel was being interviewed by NPR and talking about the show's production pipeline with the vocabulary of someone running a significant operation. That is a very different creative environment from the one that produced the first 2 seasons. The freedom that came from being a new, weird show that nobody was quite sure about, the freedom Quintel described in the Squiggly interview as never being told something was too extreme, is harder to sustain when the show has become one of the network's signature programs and 40 people's livelihoods depend on it continuing to function. Success creates its own constraints. The show that had been made by a small group of people entertaining themselves had become an institution, and institutions operate differently from experiments. The fan community's rankings of the show's seasons reflect the audience's experience of this transition with remarkable consistency. The fan-curated season ranking cited in the IMDb list community places the seasons in this order from best to worst. Season 2, Season 4, Season 1, Season 3, Season 8, Season 6, 6, Season 7, Season 5. That ranking is interesting for several reasons. Seasons 1 through 4 occupy the top 4 spots. The consensus is clear that the first 4 seasons are the show's strongest, with Season 2 at the very top. Season 2 is the season that contains some of the show's most beloved individual episodes, the seasons where the formula was freshest and the creative team was most freely following their instincts. Season 4, despite being the most watched season, ranks second rather than first, which suggests that the audience recognized the difference between the show at its most popular and the show at its most creative, and placed creative quality slightly above peak entertainment value. The bottom 4 spots are occupied by Seasons 5 through 8, with Season 7 ranking second worst, and Season 5 ranking worst of all despite coming before Seasons 6, 7, and 8. That specific placement of Season 5 at the bottom is worth thinking about. Season 5 is where the romantic arc fully took over, where the writer turnover had begun producing visible effects, and where the show first started feeling like something different from what it had been. Season 6 ranks above Season 5 in this fan consensus, despite being consistently described as the worst season by other measures, which may reflect the fact that Season 6 at least had the drama of the love triangle reaching a crisis point, whereas Season 5 was the season of setup that went nowhere and repetition that produced no payoff. Season 8 ranking 5th, above Seasons 5, 6, and 7, is also interesting. The space season, which J.G. Quintel himself initially thought was a bad idea, ranks higher in fan estimation than the 3 seasons that preceded it. This likely reflects the fact that Season 8, whatever its limitations, had a clear direction and a genuine ending. The finale worked. Pops' sacrifice landed. The 25-year epilogue gave the audience closure. Season 8 was imperfect but purposeful, and purposeful imperfection is more satisfying than the directionless quality that characterized the show's middle period. The viewership numbers and the fan rankings tell essentially the same story from 2 different angles. The show peaked at Season 4. The middle seasons, 5, 6, and 7, were where the audience eroded and the creative quality declined. Season 8 was a partial recovery that came too late to rebuild the audience that had left during the middle period. What those numbers and rankings do not fully capture is the specific mechanism by which the show went from its peak to its middle period decline. The mechanism was not laziness. The people making regular show from Season 5 onward were working just as hard as the people who had made Seasons 1 through 3. The 9-month production pipeline did not get shorter. The team did not stop caring. Quintel's interviews across the show's later seasons consistently convey the same genuine engagement with the material that his early interviews had shown. The mechanism was something more specific and more structural. The show, after its Season 4 peak, started making decisions based on what it thought it should be doing, rather than what its instincts were telling it to do. The romantic arc was a conscious attempt to give the show emotional depth and serialized storytelling that would feel more substantial than standalone episodes. The Dome arc was a conscious attempt to create sustained narrative tension. The Space arc was a conscious attempt to find new territory for a show that had run out of room in its original setting. These were deliberate, considered, discussed decisions, not accidents or oversights. And yet the results were consistently weaker than the early seasons, where the decisions had been made with less deliberation and more instinct. The show in its best years was not working hard to be good. It was following its own sense of humor into places it had not been before, and trusting that the audience would find them funny. The show in its middle and later years was working very hard to be good, and the effort was visible in a way that effort should not be in a comedy. Quintel's own description of what he and his team had been doing in the early seasons, just making things that were making them laugh and trying to push it through, is the clearest possible description of the quality that the later seasons were trying to replicate through more deliberate means. Laughter is not deliberate. Comedy that is constructed carefully and consciously can be very good, but it operates differently from comedy that comes from a group of people genuinely surprising each other. The early regular show had the second kind. The middle and later seasons increasingly had the first kind. The Season 4 premiere was the peak because it combined both. It had the instinctive energy of the early seasons and the payoff weight of 3 seasons of accumulated storytelling. It was the moment where the show's freedom and the show's success were perfectly aligned. Everything that came before it had built toward it. Everything that came after it was trying to figure out how to follow it. The show never found a fully satisfying answer to that question, and the viewership numbers trace the arc of the search. From 3.047 million at the top to 785,000 at the bottom, the show spent 4 seasons looking for a way back to something that could not be found by looking for it. The things that made Exit 9B feel like an event were not available for purchase or deliberate recreation. They were the product of a specific moment, a specific team, and a specific creative freedom that the show had in its earliest years, and that success itself had made harder to maintain. The one season that came closest to recapturing something of that original energy, without being the equal of the early seasons, was Season 7. Season 7 is consistently described in fan discussions as a part partial return to form. The Rigby arc was coherent and well executed. Some individual episodes had the kind of sharp escalation the show had been missing, and the Dome setup, while a significant departure from the original premise, at least gave the season a clear structural purpose that seasons 5 and 6 had lacked. The season's highest-rated episode still only drew 1.597 million viewers, which is barely half the show's peak audience, but the creative quality had steadied from the low point of season 6. That partial recovery matters, because it shows that the decline was not irreversible in creative terms. Even if the audience had already significantly contracted, the show could still make good episodes. The people involved were still capable of producing something that captured at least some of what had made the early seasons feel alive. But the audience that had left during the middle period did not come back for the partial recovery, and by the time the show ended in January 2017, the viewers who remained were a fraction of the 3 million who had shown up for Exit 9B in 2012. The story of regular show's rise and fall is, in this sense, a very specific story about the relationship between success and creative freedom. The show got big enough that the freedom that had created it became harder to maintain. The decisions made under those conditions moved the show away from its strengths. The audience felt the movement before anyone could fully articulate it, and they responded the way audiences always respond, by gradually finding other things to watch. And underneath all of this, running through every season and every creative decision, was the question of what the show was actually built to do. Not the romantic arcs or the space setting or the Dome experiment. Those were all attempts to find a new answer to the question. The original answer, the one that produced 3.047 million viewers and the most beloved episodes in the show's catalog, was something much simpler and much harder to hold on to once the show knew it had found it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before reaching any final conclusions about what Regular Show was and what it became, there is one more piece of the picture that has not been addressed directly. The Dome and the space arc did not arrive without warning. The seeds of both were planted in season 7, which itself represented a complete transformation of the show's physical world. And the story of how and why that transformation happened reveals something about the pressure the show was under from outside the writer's room. Pressure that came not from the audience or from the critics, but from the network that was airing the show, and the decisions it was making about where Regular Show fit into its future. Section 10. The Dome arc and space arc sacrificed the show's core premise. Regular Show had a location. That location was the park. Not just as a backdrop or a setting that the show happened to use, the park was a character in itself. In the same way that the coffee shop, the house where Mordecai and Rigby lived, the cart path, the snack bar, and the surrounding neighborhood were all characters. They were specific places that the audience knew well, and that familiarity was load-bearing. It held the show's world together. No matter how strange an episode got, no matter how far into the supernatural the plot traveled, the audience knew that the episode would eventually return to the park. The park was home. Home was where the show lived. Understanding what the Dome arc and the space arc actually cost the show requires understanding what the park gave it in the first place. The park worked as a setting because it was mundane in the exact right way. It was not interesting on its own. Two guys raking leaves and mowing grass is not a compelling premise for a television show. The creative genius of Regular Show's early seasons was the gap between how boring the setting was and how insane the things that happened in it were. An argument about who had to clean the bathroom turned into a battle against a supernatural toilet entity. A dispute about a parking spot escalated into a confrontation that threatened the fabric of reality. A prank phone call from the past created a time travel crisis. The park was the stable ground from which all of that escalation launched, and the stability of the ground was what made the escalation feel like escalation rather than just chaos. When the Dome arrived in season 7 and scientists placed a transparent bubble over the park, the stable ground became unstable. The park was still there, the trees, the cart path, the house, all of it, but it was now inside a controlled environment, being observed by outside forces. The show had introduced an element that changed the fundamental relationship between the characters and their world. They were no longer free agents doing their jobs badly and getting into supernatural trouble. They were subjects in an experiment, which is a completely different kind of story. The Dome arc had a purpose within the show's narrative. It was building toward the season 7 finale, in which the Dome's true function was revealed to be connected to the larger cosmic mythology the show had been developing around Pops and his destiny. The Dome was not random. It had a reason. But the episodes that filled the season while the Dome's purpose was being slowly revealed were episodes that had to exist within the constraints of the Dome's setting. The crew could not freely move through the world. Their interactions with the outside were limited, and the specific kind of suburban escalation that had defined the show's best episodes was harder to generate from inside a bubble. The Regular Show wiki documents that season 7's lowest-rated episode, Cube Bros, drew 785,000 viewers. That is the single lowest viewership figure in the show's entire run. The season also produced the most significant viewership drop in the show's history, from Season 6's range of 1.3 to 2.2 million down to Season 7's range of 785,000 to 1.597 million. The dome setting did not stop the decline. By several measures, it accelerated it. Then came the decision to send the park into space. The Season 7 finale, Rigby's Graduation Day special, ends with the entire park being launched into outer space. The mechanism for this involves the dome scientists and the larger mission connected to Pops' destiny, which required the park crew to travel to Pops' home planet of Lollyland to face his evil twin brother Anti-Pops. The plot logic is there. Within the show's own mythology, the space launch makes sense as a story beat, but story logic and creative logic are different things. And the creative logic of taking a show about a suburban park and setting its final season in outer space raised questions the show could not fully answer. J.G. Quintel addressed this directly in the comicbook.com interview from around the time Season 8 premiered. He said he had initially thought the space idea was dumb. He then explained the process by which he talked himself out of that initial reaction. He pointed to the regular show movie, which had been released in 2015 and which featured a plot involving Mordecai and Rigby discovering that their future selves had become space rangers. The movie had put the idea of the characters in space into the audience's imagination. When the dome arc started moving the story in a cosmic direction, the space setting started feeling less random. Quintel said he and the team eventually landed on the feeling that going to space was part of Mordecai and Rigby's story, that it had been set up and could be the natural endpoint of their journey. The regular show movie is a verified and documented piece of the show's canon. It premiered on August 14, 2015 at the Downtown Independent Theater in Los Angeles, where it ran until August 20, 2015. It then had a DVD release and premiered on Cartoon Network in November 2015. The movie was directed by Quintel himself. The plot involves Mordecai and Rigby traveling back in time to fix a mistake they had made, and during the course of that journey they encounter their future selves, who are indeed operating as space rangers. That detail was in the movie. Quintel is correct that the space idea had precedent in the show's own canon, but there is a meaningful difference between a plot detail in a standalone movie and a full season of the television series. The movie's Space Ranger version of Mordecai and Rigby was a glimpse of a possible future, one image among many in a story that was primarily about their friendship and the mistakes they make because of it. Spending an entire season of the television show in space required the setting to carry weight across 31 episodes, not just appear as a future vision in a single film. The Wikipedia article on Season 8 documents what the space setting required in production terms. The season had a new character designer from Episode 7 onward, after Ben Adams left. The writing team was producing episodes set on alien planets, inside the park dome, floating through space, on spacecraft, and in cosmic environments that the show had never had to design or write for before. The 11-minute episode format that had worked so efficiently for suburban escalation was now being used to build entire alien worlds, establish new rules for new environments, and tell stories that required the audience to orient themselves to settings they had never seen before, all in the same amount of time the early show had used to take a simple argument from zero to supernatural disaster. The Season 8 episode list shows the consequences of this. Episodes like Space Creds, in which Mordecai and Rigby want to buy hover boots but cannot afford them, and Lost and Found, in which the crew needs to retrieve a wallet on a dangerous alien planet, are recognizable regular show premises at their core. The characters want something small. Complications arise. The situation escalates. The structure is there, but the execution requires the audience to accept and engage with settings, alien currency systems, hostile planets, space-based economies that add a layer of world building between the premise and the comedy. In the early show, the world building was already done. The audience knew the park, knew the coffee shop, knew every recurring location. The comedy could begin immediately because the setting required no explanation. In Season 8, the setting required constant explanation. Every new planet was a new environment with new rules. Every space-based episode had to establish where the characters were and what the stakes of that particular location were before it could build the story. That overhead consumed runtime that the early show had used entirely for character and comedy. The fan community's response to the space arc was mixed in a specific way. The Reddit community on r/full-eps of regular show, in a thread from April 2024, shows a fan who grew up watching the show noting that they did not notice a massive decline in quality until Season 7, with a massive drop in Season 8. Another commenter in the same thread noted that some people disliked the more focused approach of Seasons 7 and 8, while others appreciated the slow build toward the finale. That division in the fan response is itself revealing. The space arc produced a reaction that was genuinely split, which means it was doing something different enough from the earlier show to generate real disagreement about whether different was good. The episodes that the Season 8 marathon skipped are documented in the regular show Lost Tapes wiki entry, which noted that when Cartoon Network ran a marathon of every regular show episode in May 2026 ahead of the revival series premiere, the marathon skipped 3 specific episodes: One Space Day at a Time, Cool Bro Bots, and Welcome to Space. The first 2 of those episodes aired after the series premiere of the revival, rather than as part of the marathon. Welcome to Space was missing from the marathon entirely. Those 3 episodes are all from the very beginning of Season 8, and their absence from a marathon designed to celebrate the show's entire run suggests that even in the context of a promotional event designed to put the show's best foot forward, those early space episodes were not the ones the network most wanted to lead with. That is a small detail, but a specific one. The marathon was supposed to be a celebration. The fact that it quietly deprioritized the opening episodes of the space arc, the episodes that represented the show's most dramatic departure from its original premise, is a measurable indication of how those episodes were perceived relative to the rest of the show's catalog. Quintel's own admission that the space arc was initially something he thought was dumb gains additional weight when placed next to these details. He overcame his initial instinct. He found a rationale. He made the season. The season ended the show. But the initial instinct that putting a park-based suburban comedy into outer space was a bad idea was the instinct that had produced seasons 1 through 4. That instinct understood what the show was. The reasoning that overrode it understood what the show could technically do within its own established mythology, but that is a different kind of understanding, and it produced a different kind of result. There is also the matter of what the space arc did to the show's supporting cast. The park crew in space included Mordecai, Rigby, Benson, Skips, Pops, Muscleman, High Five Ghost, and Eileen. All of them were now floating through the universe in a dome. The characters who had been defined by their relationships to specific places. Benson as the park manager, whose authority was tied to the park itself. Skips as the groundskeeper, whose ancient wisdom was rooted in the specific history of that particular piece of land. Pops as the gentle presence whose home was the house on the park grounds, were now stripped of the physical context that had given their roles meaning. Benson in space could not threaten to fire anyone, because firing someone in space would mean leaving them to die. His primary mode of character expression, the constant threat of termination directed at Mordecai and Rigby, became functionally meaningless in the new setting. The show acknowledged this, more or less, by giving Benson a different kind of story in Season 8. His relationship with a dome scientist named Pam, the grief of being separated from his home, the challenge of adapting to a completely new environment. Those are real stories that the show handled with some care, but they are different from what Benson had always been, and the difference made him feel like a version of the character rather than the character himself. Skips is similarly affected. Skips had always been defined by his ancient knowledge of the park's history and the supernatural forces that connected to it. He was the person who knew how things worked because he had been at the park for centuries. In space, that specific knowledge was irrelevant. The things that made Skips the most useful and interesting member of the park crew in the early seasons, his deep connection to the particular history of that particular place, did not travel with him into the cosmos. In space, he was simply a large and strong Yeti, which is a much less interesting version of the character. Pops is the exception to this pattern, because Pops' story in Season 8 is directly tied to the cosmic mythology that the space arc was built to resolve. Pops being revealed as the chosen one, destined to fight his evil twin Anti-Pops on his home planet of Lollyland, is the storyline that gives the space arc its purpose and its emotional weight. The finale works as well as it does, largely because Pops' sacrifice is the culmination of a storyline that had been built carefully across multiple seasons. His gentle and childlike nature, his deep love for the people around him, and the cosmic significance of his existence all came together in the finale in a way that genuinely landed for the audience. Pops' arc in Season 8 is the strongest single character arc the season produced. But one strong character arc does not redeem a full season of structural compromise. The show had placed all of its best storytelling eggs in the Pops basket, and the other 20-plus episodes of the season were largely filler around that central story. Episodes that existed to fill time between the cosmic mythology beats, set in a space environment that the show had never been built for and could not fully inhabit. The regular show movie had set up the Space Ranger future. The Dome arc had moved the story into science fiction territory. The space arc was the logical conclusion of both of those things. But logical conclusions and satisfying ones are different categories, and regular show had always been a show that operated on satisfaction rather than logic. The early show's plots made no logical sense. A keyboard that lets you do anything, a wrestling dojo that teaches a move that can split the earth, a video game where losing means dying in real life. None of that is logical. It is satisfying because it follows the internal emotional logic of the characters and their relationships, not because it follows any external rules about how things work. The space arc followed external logic. The show had set up a space future in the movie, therefore the show could go to space, while losing the internal emotional logic that had always been the show's actual engine. The early seasons did not work because they followed rules rules. They worked because they followed feelings. Two friends trying to avoid work feel a specific way. Two friends stranded in outer space feel a different way. The first feeling was the one regular show had been built to express, and the second was the one it spent its final season trying to adapt to. Quintel knew this on some level when he initially called the idea dumb. The word dumb is not a technical criticism. It is an instinctive one. Something that is dumb is something that does not feel right, even if the logic for it is there. His instinct was registering a mismatch between the idea and the show's identity. He overrode that instinct for reasons that were defensible and real. The movie precedent, the mythological setup, the desire to give the show a grand final chapter. The override produced Season 8, which produced a finale that worked as a conclusion even as the season around it struggled to justify the setting that had been chosen for it. The show ended in January 2017. It left behind 8 seasons, 244 episodes, and a viewership arc that went from 2 million to 3 million, back down below 1 million. The park that had been the show's home for 7 seasons existed in space for 1 season and then came back to Earth for a flash forward that showed it 25 years later, populated by statues of Pops and his father, with Benson still working as manager and Skips still there in his usual spot. The park outlasted the space arc. It was always going to. The park was what the show was. The space arc was what the show decided to do with itself in its final year, for reasons that made sense in a production meeting and felt wrong to the person making the decision before he had fully talked himself out of that feeling. What remains is the question of whether any of this was inevitable, whether a show that peaked as early and as high as regular show did was always going to face a decline in its middle and later seasons, or whether specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments changed the trajectory of something that might otherwise have held its quality longer. That question does not have a clean answer, but sitting at the center of it, having now looked at the viewership numbers and the writer turnover and the romance arc and the Flanderization and the Thomas situation and the space decision and the finale's resolution, is the clearest and most honest statement ever made by the show's creator about what happened to regular show across its 8 seasons. A statement that was not made in any interview, but was embedded in the show's own structure, in the gap between what it was at its best and what it became by the time it ended. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.